I never thought cleaning out an old attic would lead to the most terrifying experience of my life. It started on a Saturday afternoon when my landlord asked me to help clear out the dusty, cobwebbed storage space in the house we shared. The house itself was ancient, one of those Victorian-style homes with creaky wooden floors and a history that seemed to cling to the walls like old wallpaper. The attic was no different, dark, musty, and filled with boxes that looked like they hadn't been touched in decades. Among the piles of forgotten trinkets and moth-eaten blankets, I found a small, battered wooden chest. Its hinges were rusted, and it had a faint smell of mildew. Something about it felt off. Curiosity got the better of me, so I pried it open. Inside was a vintage camcorder, the kind people used in the late 90s. It was heavier than I expected, with a cracked viewfinder and a layer of dust so thick it coated my fingers. Next to it was a stack of old videotapes labeled in faded black marker. Family Picnic 1999, Christmas Morning 2000, Diane's 10th birthday. The last one caught my attention. Its label read, "Do not watch." The letters were scratched into the tape's plastic surface, as though written in a moment of desperation. Of course, that only made me want to watch it more. I brought the camcorder and tapes downstairs to my room. As I cleaned the lens and dusted off the tapes, I felt a strange unease creeping over me. It wasn't fear exactly, more like the sense that I was about to open a door I couldn't close. Still, I brushed it off. I mean, it was probably just an old home video someone didn't want anyone else to see. Maybe it was embarrassing or personal. The camcorder still worked after I plugged it in, though the playback screen flickered faintly. I slid the "Do Not Watch" tape into the slot, pressed play, and waited. At first, there was nothing, just static and faint white noise. Then, the image began to appear. It was a shaky handheld recording of a dense forest at dusk. The person behind the camera was breathing heavily, their steps crunching on the underbrush. They didn't speak, but their panicked, erratic movements told me something was very wrong. The footage cut abruptly, jumping to what looked like a small clearing. There was a tent in the middle, torn to shreds, with the remains of a campfire smoldering nearby. The camera zoomed in on the tent, the lens shaking so much I could barely make out the details. But then I saw it, a dark, glistening stain on the fabric. Blood. My stomach turned, but I couldn't look away. The video cut again, this time to the interior of what looked like an old cabin. The walls were bare wood, and the only source of light came from a flickering lantern on a table. There was something carved into the walls. Symbols I didn't recognize, crude and jagged, like they'd been scratched with a knife. The camera panned slowly, almost reluctantly, until it landed on a figure in the corner of the room. It was a man, sitting motionless in a wooden chair. His face was turned away, but his body was stiff like a mannequin. The person filming seemed hesitant to get closer, but they did. And then the man turned his head. His eyes were wide and glassy, his mouth hanging open in a silent scream. For a moment, I thought he was dead, but then his head jerked unnaturally, like a puppet being yanked by invisible strings. The screen distorted, the audio cutting in and out with a high-pitched whine. I hit the pause button, my heart pounding in my chest. What the hell had I just watched? I wanted to stop. I wanted to put the tape back in that chest and pretend I'd never seen it. But something in me, a morbid curiosity maybe, refused to let me turn away. I took a deep breath, pressed play again, and braced myself. The screen returned to static, and then, slowly, the image of a mirror appeared. The camera was focused on its reflection. At first, I couldn't see anything unusual. But then, a shadow moved across the frame. Something inhuman. It wasn't just a shadow. It was watching me. Or at least, that's how it felt. The tape ended suddenly with a sharp screeching sound, and the screen went black. I sat there in silence, the weight of what I'd just seen pressing down on me like a lead blanket. That's when I noticed something strange. The room felt colder, and the shadows seemed thicker. I glanced at the mirror on my wall, and for a split second, I thought I saw movement. Something, no, someone, was in the reflection, standing just behind me. I spun around, but there was no one there. Just an empty room. But the feeling didn't leave me. It stayed with me, lingering like the static on that tape. And that's when I knew. Whatever I'd just uncovered wasn't meant to be found. The first time I pressed play, I thought I could handle it. After all, it was just a videotape, right? But the more I watched, the more it felt like the tape was watching me back. I couldn't stop thinking about the man in the chair, his glassy eyes, his jerking movements. It wasn't natural. None of it was. And the symbols carved into the cabin walls. I didn't recognize them, but something about them stirred an uneasy familiarity in me, like my mind was trying to warn me about something I couldn't quite grasp. Still, curiosity won over fear. It always does, doesn't it? I rewound the tape and hit play again. This time, I noticed details I'd missed before. Details that made my skin crawl. The forest scene played again, but something was different. The camera wasn't just shaking from the person's footsteps. There were faint, distant noises in the background. Branches snapping, low growls, almost too quiet to hear. Whoever was filming kept glancing over their shoulder, as if they knew they were being followed. Then came the clearing with the torn tent. But this time, as the camera panned across the wreckage, I noticed something else. A pair of eyes glinting from the tree line, reflecting the dim light like an animal's. They were there for only a second before disappearing into the shadows. I paused the tape and stared at the screen. I couldn't be sure if I'd really seen them or if my imagination was running wild. But deep down, I knew. The person filming wasn't alone. When the tape jumped to the cabin again, I braced myself. The carved symbols on the walls seemed to writhe and shift, like they were alive. I paused the video again, rewinding it just a little to make sure I wasn't imagining it. But it wasn't my imagination. As I played the scene frame by frame, I realized that the symbols weren't static. They were changing. Lines appeared where there hadn't been any before, forming new shapes, new patterns. And then I saw it. A crude, almost childlike drawing of a face. Its eyes were wide and empty, its mouth stretched into a grin that felt more like a threat than a smile. I couldn't shake the feeling that the face was looking directly at me. Then the camera turned to the man in the chair again. His head was slumped forward this time, and his body was still, like he'd gone completely lifeless. But as the camera moved closer, the audio picked up something faint. A whisper, so soft it was almost drowned out by the hum of the lantern. I turned up the volume, straining to make out the words. Leave before it's too late. The voice was low, raspy, and didn't match the man in the chair. It sounded distant, as though coming from deep within the cabin itself. The camera suddenly jerked, as if the person filming had been startled. The man in the chair was moving again, but this time, it wasn't a slow, jerking motion. He was twitching violently, his head snapping back and forth like he was being controlled by invisible strings. And then, he looked at the camera. His mouth opened wide, wider than it should have been humanly possible. And he let out a sound that made my blood run cold. It wasn't a scream, it wasn't even a growl. It was a horrible, guttural noise that seemed to vibrate through the air, like the sound of metal scraping against bone. The screen distorted, the audio cutting in and out, and for a moment, I thought the tape was about to end, but it didn't. The next scene was back in the forest. The person filming was running now, their breathing fast and panicked. The camera jostled wildly, catching glimpses of trees, shadows, and flashes of movement behind them. Whatever had been in the cabin was following them. And then I saw it. Just for a split second, but long enough to make my heart stop. It was tall, impossibly thin, and its limbs were too long, too angular. It moved in a way that didn't make sense, like it was glitching out of reality. Its face, if you could call it that, was pale and featureless, except for the same wide, empty eyes and grotesque grin I'd seen carved into the walls. The person filming tripped, the camera tumbling to the ground. The lens cracked, but the recording didn't stop. I could hear their ragged breaths, their frantic whispers. It's here. It's here. It's here. They tried to crawl away, but the thing was faster. The last thing the camera captured was a pale hand, its fingers too long, its nails sharp as knives, reaching down. And then, static. I sat there in silence, my hands trembling as I clutched the camcorder. Every instinct in my body told me to destroy the tape, to get rid of it before whatever was on it could find me. But I couldn't. Something about it had hooked itself into my mind, a sinister curiosity that refused to let go. I needed to know more. I rewound the tape again, ready to watch it from the beginning. But this time, when I hit play, the screen didn't show the forest. It showed my room. The camcorder dropped from my hands, clattering to the floor. The screen flickered once, twice, and then went dark. But even with the tape stopped, I could feel it. I wasn't alone anymore. I didn't sleep that night. How could I? The footage didn't just stay on the screen. It followed me, clawing its way into my mind. Even after I turned off the camcorder and shoved the tape back into its box, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was watching me from the shadows of my room. At some point in the dead of night, I heard it, a faint tapping sound. It wasn't coming from outside my window or from the attic above. It was coming from the mirror across the room. Tap, 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 my chest tightened. The mirror reflected nothing but the darkness of the room. Yet, I could feel something lurking just beyond the glass. I didn't dare approach it. Instead, I grabbed my phone and turned on the flashlight, aiming it at the mirror. For a moment, I thought it was just my reflection staring back. But then my reflection moved. Not me. My reflection. Its head tilted slightly, the corners of its mouth curling into a grin, far too wide, too sharp. The grin I'd seen on the tape. I scrambled back, knocking over a chair in my panic. The tapping grew louder, more insistent, until it became a pounding, as though something inside the mirror was trying to break through. And then, the glass cracked. A jagged fissure ran across the surface, but it didn't shatter completely. Instead, a pale hand, long, bony, with claws like knives, pushed through the crack. I froze. My breath caught in my throat as the hand reached for me. That's when I did the only thing I could think of. I grabbed the camcorder. My hands were trembling so badly that it took me a few tries to load the tape. I hit play, and the familiar static filled the screen. I didn't know what I was expecting, but I was desperate for anything that could stop what was happening. As the footage began to play, the pounding on the mirror stopped. The room grew eerily silent, save for the faint crackling of the tape. I glanced at the mirror and saw the hand retreating back into the glass, the crack slowly sealing itself. But the relief was short-lived. The tape began to distort, the footage skipping and flickering, the forest, the cabin, the symbols. They all appeared in quick succession, flashing across the screen like some twisted slideshow. And then, the screen went black. A voice, low and guttural, came through the speakers. "You shouldn't have watched." The lights in my room flickered, and I felt a chill so cold it pierced my bones. I tried to eject the tape, but the camcorder wouldn't open. It was as if the machine itself was alive, holding on to the tape with a grip I couldn't break. The voice continued, whispering things I couldn't understand. Words in a language that sounded ancient, unnatural. The symbols from the cabin appeared on the screen again, but this time they burned themselves into my vision, lingering even when I closed my eyes. And then I heard it. Footsteps. They were slow and deliberate, coming from just outside my door. I wanted to run, to scream, but I couldn't move. The handle of my door turned, creaking loudly in the silence. My heart pounded so hard it felt like it would burst. The door opened, and for a moment, there was nothing but darkness on the other side. But then it stepped in. The figure from the tape. It was taller than I'd imagined, its limbs impossibly long, its head tilted at an unnatural angle. The grin on its face stretched wider and wider as it moved closer, its empty eyes locked on me. It didn't speak, but its presence screamed volumes. I did the only thing I could think of. I threw the camcorder at it. The moment the camcorder hit the ground, the tape inside burst into flames. The figure let out an ear-piercing shriek, its body twisting and contorting as though it was being torn apart. The fire spread quickly, consuming the camcorder, the tape, and everything around it. And then, as suddenly as it started, it was over. The flames vanished, leaving no trace of the camcorder or the tape. The room was silent again, but the damage had been done. I left the house that night and never went back. For weeks I couldn't sleep, couldn't eat. Every shadow, every creak of the floorboards felt like a reminder of what I'd seen. I tried to convince myself that it was over, that the tape had been destroyed, and whatever curse it carried had died with it. But some nights, when the world is quiet and the darkness feels too heavy, I still hear it. Tap, 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 the sound of something trying to break through. It all started with a box. A dusty, unassuming box tucked away in the corner of my late uncle's attic. He passed away a month ago, leaving behind a crumbling old house filled with memories no one wanted to remember. Being the only one with enough free time, my family thought it'd be fitting for me to clear out the place. At first, I thought the attic was just like the rest of the house. Dull, suffocating, and reeking of mildew. The wooden floor creaked beneath my weight, and the single bulb hanging from the ceiling flickered weakly. Boxes upon boxes of forgotten junk surrounded me, their labels faded and their contents long forgotten. I was about to call it a day when I saw it. The box wasn't like the others. While everything else was covered in years of dust and cobwebs, this box looked different. The lid was slightly ajar, the edges worn but recently disturbed. Curiosity got the better of me, and I knelt down to open it. Inside, I found a camcorder, a Sony Handycam, to be precise. It looked ancient with scuff marks along the edges and a faded sticker on the side that read, "Property of James H. Do not touch." My uncle's name. I remember chuckling at that. Uncle James always had a flair for drama. Alongside the camcorder, there was a stack of mini DV tapes, neatly labeled with dates ranging from 2004 to 2006. Something about it felt strange. Uncle James was never the sentimental type. Why would he keep these tapes so carefully stored? I dusted off the camcorder, popped in the first tape, and pressed play. The screen flickered to life, grainy and distorted. It showed my uncle, younger and happier, setting up the camera in what appeared to be a dense forest. The footage was shaky at first, but soon he adjusted the angle, giving me a clear view of the campsite. "This is it," Uncle James said to the camera, a strange excitement in his voice. "This is the place they talked about. If the stories are true, I'll have proof by morning." I paused the tape. What stories? Proof of what? Unable to shake the curiosity, I fast-forwarded through the rest of the tape. Most of it was mundane. Shots of the forest, James sitting by a campfire, and occasional muttering about setting up the traps. It wasn't until the last few minutes of the tape that things took a darker turn. The screen went black, and then there was a loud crash. The camera jolted violently, as if James had dropped it. Heavy breathing filled the speakers, followed by hurried footsteps crunching through leaves. "I can't see it," James whispered, his voice trembling. "But it's here. I know it's here." The tape ended abruptly, cutting to static. I stared at the camcorder, my heart racing. What had James seen? Why did he sound so terrified? My hands shook as I reached for the next tape. The label on this one read, June 12th, 2005, The Cabin. I pressed play, and this time, the footage showed James walking through what appeared to be an abandoned cabin in the woods. The air inside felt heavy, even through the screen. As I watched, I couldn't help but feel like I wasn't alone in the room anymore. The faint hum of the attic light buzzed louder than before, and the shadows in the corners seemed to shift. I told myself it was just my imagination, a side effect of spending too much time alone in this creepy old house. But deep down, I wasn't so sure. Before I knew it, hours had passed. I watched tape after tape, each one more bizarre than the last. James spoke of figures in the trees, of strange whispers at night, and of waking up to find things moved around his campsite. He looked gaunt and paranoid, a shadow of the man I once knew. Then came the final tape. The label was different. No date, no location, just a single word, scrawled in shaky handwriting, "Don't." My stomach tightened as I held it in my hands. Part of me wanted to stop, to shove everything back into the box and leave. But another part, the part that craved answers, refused to let go. I slid the tape into the camcorder, pressed play, and braced myself. The footage was chaos. The camera shook violently, the audio distorted by a deafening static. James was running, screaming, but his words were lost in the noise. Flashes of movement appeared on the screen. Dark figures, too fast to make out. And then, just as suddenly as it started, the footage cut to black. I sat there in silence, my mind racing. What had my uncle stumbled upon? Was any of it even real? As I stared at the blank screen, I noticed something strange. The attic was silent, too silent. The faint hum of the light bulb was gone, replaced by an oppressive stillness. And then I heard it. A soft rustling sound coming from the corner of the attic. I turned slowly, my breath catching in my throat. The box was empty. I don't know how long I sat there, staring at that empty box. My hands were clammy, my breath uneven. I tried to rationalize it. Maybe I had knocked the box over without realizing. Or maybe the tapes weren't really gone, and I was just too spooked to think straight. But no matter how much I tried to convince myself, I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone in the attic. The rustling sound came again, louder this time, from behind a stack of old furniture near the far wall. My heart pounded as I stood, gripping the camcorder like a weapon. I told myself it was just a rat, or maybe the wind, moving through a crack in the roof. But deep down, I knew better. "Hello?" I called out, my voice trembling. The attic remained silent. Slowly, I crept toward the source of the noise. Each step felt heavier than the last, the floorboards groaning beneath my weight. As I approached, the shadows seemed to deepen, swallowing the weak light from the single bulb. And then I saw it. Nestled between a broken chair and an old wardrobe was one of the tapes. It was the last one, the one labeled "Don't." Only now, the word had been scratched out, replaced by deep, jagged marks that looked like they'd been carved by fingernails. My stomach turned as I bent down to pick it up. The tape was warm to the touch, almost uncomfortably so, as if it had been sitting in direct sunlight. But that didn't make sense. This was a windowless attic, and it was the dead of night. I shoved the tape into my pocket and backed away, keeping my eyes on the dark corner. Whatever was there, I didn't want to see it. I hurried downstairs, my footsteps echoing in the empty house. By the time I reached the living room, I was out of breath, my hands trembling. I slammed the attic door shut behind me and wedged a chair under the handle for good measure. That's when I noticed the static. The camcorder in my hand had turned itself on, the tiny screen flickering with grainy white noise. My fingers hovered over the buttons, but before I could touch anything, the static shifted. Shadows began to form on the screen, twisting and merging until they took shape. It was a face. Not a human face, though. Its features were wrong. Too sharp, too distorted, like a bad imitation of what a person should look like. Its eyes were empty sockets, and its mouth stretched into an impossibly wide grin. I dropped the camcorder with a yelp, the screen shattering against the hardwood floor. But even as the device lay there, broken and lifeless, I could still hear the static. And then the whispers started. At first, they were faint, barely audible over the pounding of my heart. But they grew louder, overlapping voices that spoke in a language I couldn't understand. They seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere, all at once, filling the room with a suffocating presence. I grabbed my phone and opened the flashlight, sweeping the beam across the room. Nothing. The house was empty, just as it had been when I arrived. But the whispers didn't stop. Desperate for answers, I pulled the tape from my pocket. It felt heavier now, as though it was dragging me down with it. I hesitated, but I knew there was no turning back. Whatever was happening, the answers had to be on that tape. I searched the house for an old TV with a VHS player, which I remembered seeing in the basement earlier that day. My hands were shaking so badly that it took me several tries to get the tape into the player. When I finally pressed play, The screen lit up with static, and I braced myself for whatever horrors was about to unfold. The footage began, like the others, showing my Uncle James. He was in the same forest from the earlier tapes, his face pale and his eyes sunken. He looked like he hadn't slept in days. "They're watching me," he whispered, his voice barely audible. "I don't know who or what they are, but they're everywhere. In the trees, in the shadows. I can't escape them." The camera panned around, showing glimpses of movement between the trees, dark, humanoid shapes that flickered in and out of sight. The audio crackled, and James's breathing grew heavier. "I shouldn't have come here," he continued. "They warned me, but I didn't listen. Now it's too late." The footage cut to black for several seconds before returning. This time James was in the cabin. The walls were covered in strange symbols, drawn in what looked like blood. He was holding the camera close to his face, his eyes wide with fear. "If you're watching this," he said, his voice trembling, "don't make the same mistake I did. Don't follow the whispers. Don't let them in." The screen flickered and suddenly the camera fell to the ground. The image was crooked, showing James backing away from something off-screen. "They're here," he whispered. "Oh God, they're here." A loud crash echoed through the speakers, and James screamed. The last thing the camera captured was a dark figure lunging toward him, its distorted face filling the frame. The tape ended, leaving me staring at the static. But the whispers didn't stop. I turned off the TV and stumbled back, my mind racing. The symbols on the cabin walls, the dark figures in the forest, the distorted face on the camcorder. It was all connected. Whatever had happened to James wasn't over. I wasn't alone in the house anymore. The shadows in the corners seemed to shift, growing darker and more defined. The air grew heavy, and I could feel something watching me, waiting. And then, from somewhere upstairs, I heard the sound of footsteps. Slow, deliberate footsteps. The footsteps were steady and deliberate, each one echoing through the empty house. My entire body froze, my mind racing through every possible explanation, none of which made sense. No one else was supposed to be here. "Who's there?" I shouted, though my voice came out shaky and far less confident than I'd hoped. No response. The footsteps stopped abruptly, leaving a suffocating silence in their wake. My flashlight shook in my hand as I pointed it toward the staircase. For a moment, nothing happened, and then the floorboards upstairs creaked. The air around me felt heavy, thick with an unnatural chill that seemed to seep into my bones. I took a step back, my instincts screaming at me to run, but something rooted me in place. It was as if the house itself was holding me hostage, feeding off my fear. And then I saw it. A shadow moved at the top of the stairs. Not just a shadow, but something darker, something wrong. It didn't move like a person. It shifted unnaturally, its limbs bending and twisting as it descended the stairs. My flashlight flickered, the beam cutting in and out as I watched the figure grow closer. It wasn't fully visible yet, but I could feel its presence, an overwhelming sense of malice that made it hard to breathe. I stumbled backward, nearly tripping over the corner of the rug. My mind screamed at me to look away, but I couldn't. My eyes were locked on the stairs, on the thing that was coming for me. And then the whispers started again. Louder this time. They weren't coming from the tape anymore. They were all around me, inside me. Words I couldn't understand, voices overlapping in a maddening cacophony. The shadow reached the bottom of the stairs, and for the first time, I saw its face. Or what was supposed to be a face. It was the same distorted grin I'd seen on the camcorder, the same empty sockets where eyes should have been. But now, it was real, and it was looking right at me. "Why are you here?" it rasped, its voice a guttural whisper that sent chills down my spine. I couldn't answer. My mouth opened, but no sound came out. The figure took a step closer, its movements jerky and unnatural. The air grew colder with every step it took, and the shadows in the room seemed to ripple and stretch toward it, like they were alive. In a desperate bid to escape, I bolted for the door. My hands fumbled with the lock, but no matter how hard I tried, it wouldn't budge. The whispers grew louder, drowning out my panicked thoughts. "Don't leave," the voice hissed, now directly behind me. I turned, and the figure was inches away. Its grin widened impossibly, revealing rows of jagged teeth that glinted in the faint light. "Play the tape," it demanded. My trembling hands fumbled in my pocket, pulling out the tape. I didn't know why I obeyed, but it felt like I didn't have a choice. My body wasn't my own anymore, moving like a puppet on strings. I jammed the tape back into the VHS player and pressed play. The screen lit up with static. But this time, it wasn't just footage. It was me. The screen showed me standing in the living room, staring at the TV. But there was something behind me. A shadow, growing larger and larger until it consumed the entire frame. I turned to look behind me, but there was nothing there. When I looked back at the screen, the shadow was gone. Instead, the TV now showed the attic, the camera panning slowly across the room. I watched in horror as the footage zoomed in on the corner where I'd found the last tape, but instead of an empty space, there was a figure crouched there, staring directly at the camera. Its head tilted unnaturally as it grinned. And then it spoke. "You can't leave," it said, its voice overlapping with the whispers. "You belong to us now." The screen went black, and the house plunged into complete silence. For a moment, I thought it was over. But then the static returned, accompanied by the faint sound of laughter. Soft at first, but growing louder and more sinister. The lights in the house flickered, and I felt a cold hand brush against my shoulder. I spun around, but no one was there.